When you hear or see the words Game Freak, you probably think of Pokemon. Game Freak is the company responsible for the Pokemon franchise, and it's one of the largest video game franchises in the world. Since the success of Pokemon Red and Blue in the late 90s, Pokemon has been the majority of the focus of titles produced by Game Freak. Game Freak actually got their start in the 1980s, and Pokemon didn't release in Japan years later until 1996. Game Freak has produced a lot of games besides Pokemon, especially before the release of Red and Blue, some of which I didn't even know were made by Game Freak. A lot of the same people who worked on Pokemon games were around since before Pokemon with Game Freak, and you can see some of that style rub off in the other games produced by Game Freak. In this video, I want to talk about the history of Game Freak a little bit, as well as the games they've created that aren't Pokemon games. Game Freak actually produced quite a few games that aren't Pokemon, but due to Pokemon's insane popularity, Pokemon tends to overshadow all of these other games. There are still some pretty neat games out there, some of which I've actually tried in the past and not known they were made by Game Freak, and some that I would love to try in the future. I'm not going to go over every single game made by Game Freak, as there is quite a few, just the ones that I find the most interesting. The first one I want to discuss is Mendel Palace, the first game released by Game Freak, which is a game for the NES released in 1989. The game was designed by Satoshi Tajiri, the creator of Pokemon, and featured art from Ken Sugimori, who also worked on the art for Red and Blue. If you look at the game's box art for Mendel Palace, you can see the resemblance to early Pokemon a little bit, but the game itself is very different from Pokemon itself. Mendel Palace is a puzzle game that looks pretty good for an NES game, which involves moving floor tiles around and dodging enemies in a puzzle-like fashion. The game seems pretty simple and standard for something released for the NES at the time. The story is based around the main character having to save his girlfriend, who was kidnapped by some random little girl, and overall, this seems like a pretty run-of-the-mill NES game for the time that doesn't look too bad. Did you guys know that the first video game to feature Yoshi as the main character was developed by Game Freak as well? The original Yoshi released for the NES in Japan in late 1991, and in the rest of the world in 1992. The game has some different names outside of Japan, and is known as Mario and Yoshi in Europe in case you guys live over there. This isn't like a typical Yoshi's Island game, and it is considered a Yoshi side game, as it's a puzzle game involving matching various items as opposed to the usual Yoshi platformers. This is another simple puzzle game, but showing that Nintendo trusted a company like Game Freak this early on in their lifespan to produce a video game starring Yoshi, one of their main characters, and Mario, their icon, is pretty impressive. I bet Game Freak's involvement with Yoshi had something to do with Nintendo picking up the Pokemon games for Red and Blue, since they had a taste of what Game Freak was capable of and had some trust built with them. Now this next thing isn't exactly a game, but it did release for the Game Boy, and Game Freak was responsible for making the Game Boy camera back in 1998. I never had this thing as a kid, but I remember friends having it and it was always very cool at the time. You could take pictures with your Game Boy and edit them with various little images and effects and filter-like items. It was black and white, of course, as it was just a Game Boy, but you could even turn the camera around to face you as well and take a selfie-style picture way ahead of its time. There was even a printer accessory for the Game Boy where you could print out these pictures you took with the Game Boy camera. It was essentially Snapchat for the Game Boy. This picture printing mechanic was even present in Gold and Silver with your Pokemon, which might not have been possible without Game Freak's involvement with the Game Boy camera years prior. This next game is the only game I knew Game Freak made besides Pokemon before making this video, and that is Pulseman. This one seems to be one of the more popular Game Freak games that aren't Pokemon, and it was a platform released in 1994 for the Sega Mega Drive, interestingly enough, and not a Nintendo console. It was never officially released for the Genesis, which is the American version of the Mega Drive, but it was released for the Wii Virtual Console back in 2009. The game reminds me a little bit of Mega Man as a whole, and it's nice seeing Game Freak produce something that isn't a puzzle game at this time. The game looks very good for a game released in the mid-90s, and hopefully we can see this game released virtually somehow, as the Wii's eShop was shut down recently, meaning we can't download this game anymore. I would personally love to play this one as well, and Pulseman even has a few references in Pokemon games. The computer that was responsible for creating Pulseman was called the Saint Anne, which is the Japanese name for the SS Anne in Vermilion City. Pikachu's signature attack, Volt Tackle, happens to be one of Pulseman's moves as well, and some other Pokemon are said to resemble other Pulseman characters and enemies, which could just be a coincidence, but if that's the case, that's still pretty cool. It seems like Pulseman was very special at Game Freak due to all these references, as you don't really see too many references to other Game Freak games in Pokemon. Now, I actually had to double take when I saw the title of this next video game, and I'm still surprised that Game Freak would even consider making this. In 2015, Game Freak developed a game called Tembo the Badass Elephant, which released for the PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and Windows, and was published by Sega. Tembo is a 2D side-scrolling game where you take control of a military elephant named Tembo to stop the invasion of an evil organization called the Phantom in Shell City. Tembo is essentially Rambo if he were an elephant, which is actually a quote from somebody who worked on the game, and I'm surprised I haven't heard more about this game before making this video. Tembo received some rather mediocre scores all around from various different review outlets, but the reviews don't seem terrible, and it's definitely a game that I think is at least worth trying. Tembo the Badass Elephant is currently available on Steam for $15, so it's one of the more accessible games on this list if you ever wish to go play that game, so if you want to play that game, there you go. Now, as a kid, I played my Game Boy Advance a ton. It is probably the system I have the most games for, despite its relatively short lifespan, and one of the games that always caught my interest as a kid seeing it in stores was Drill Dozer. This game was never released in PAL regions, unfortunately, so some of you guys might not be familiar with this game, but I remember seeing it in stores and thought it looked like a very interesting and fun game. I didn't even know it was made by Game Freak until I started making this video, so maybe that had something to do with why it caught my eye as a kid. It's a platformer that revolves around drilling through certain areas and fighting enemies with your drill. It's essentially as if Big Doug and Mega Man had a baby, and although I've never had a chance to play Drill Dozer, it looks really fun. The art style is very different than traditional Pokemon style, and it reminds me a little bit of a WarioWare type game which you would see in the early 2000s. The drill also gives me a Gurren Lagann type vibes because of the drill, I guess, and I could have sworn there was a DS version of this game as well, but apparently that isn't the case. The game even features this really cool cartridge with an extender on it that allows for rumble and other mechanics, which I think was a very nice touch. Unfortunately, this makes the cartridge a little bit expensive on the secondary market, as it still retails for $30+ used. Hopefully I can track one down one day and play it, but only time will tell. Overall, this game is very appealing to me due to the art style and gameplay style as well. Drill Dozer does a great job embodying everything that makes a GBA game, and it just screams early 2000 with this art style, which I absolutely love. This game was unfortunately released rather late in the GBA's lifecycle, but it seems like the concept would even hold up today if they were to re-release it. Maybe we'll get a new version, a sequel, or just a virtual console re-release at this, so that way we can experience this game even more. If I do ever manage to track down a copy of Drill Dozer and play it for myself, I would really like to make a dedicated video just to Drill Dozer itself. It seems like the most interesting game produced by Game Freak that's not Pokemon in my opinion, and I think it would be really fun to take a more in-depth look at a game produced by Game Freak that wasn't Pokemon. And the last game I want to talk about is an unreleased Switch game being developed by Game Freak that is currently referred to as Town. The title is subject to change, as we have learned from the trailer that we saw a few months ago, and we don't know much about it, but it is certainly a game I plan on getting from the little bit that we know so far whenever it comes out. From the trailer we saw last year, the game is supposed to all take place in one town known for having everlasting peace. Suddenly, monsters appear in this town, and it's your job to fight them and protect the town with your fellow villagers and discover what the secret of the village is and why these monsters appeared out of nowhere. The art style reminds me a little bit of Ni no Kuni with that anime art style, and so far all we know about it besides that is that it has a release date of sometime in 2019. As much as I love Pokemon, I am very happy to see Game Freak continue to produce other games besides Pokemon, and I hope Town does well so we continue to see other games like it and support Game Freak's other games besides Pokemon. There's a few other Game Freak games that were released only in Japan that little information is known on, and a few other smaller games produced by Game Freak as well. There's one game made by Game Freak called Magical Talutulo, which I don't think I am saying right at all, which is based on an early 90s anime at the time, and a horse racing game for the 3DS, which I vaguely remember seeing in an E3 conference or Nintendo Direct or something like that, which just shows how diverse Game Freak can be outside of Pokemon, despite Pokemon being their most popular franchise by far, and the thing that they are known for the most. So let me know in the comment section down below if you've played any of Game Freak's other games, and if you even realize that those games were made by Game Freak. I would guess that if anybody watching this video played a game on this list produced by Game Freak, it would probably be Drill Dozer or the Game Boy Camera, since those are the two I remember the most as a kid, and they're probably the most popular as well. Make sure you guys leave a like on the video as well, as it helps the channel a ton. I really do appreciate it, and subscribe with notifications turned on so you don't miss a future upload of mine. And with all that being said, thank you guys so much for watching. Have a great rest of your day. I will see you all next time, and bye bye.